What's happening, YouTube? My name is Immortal Coil, and today we are talking about the most savage and the most spiritual moments of Star Wars. The top 5 most savage moments in Star Wars. Coming in at number 5 is going to be Darth Sidious versus Maul and Savage Opress. This happens in Season 5, Episode 16 of the Clone Wars series, in the episode entitled The Lawless. Now, building up to these events, we know that Maul got cut down by Obi-Wan, and after he was rebuilt by his mother Talzin, him and Savage Opress go about building their own crime syndicate, which is headquartered on Mandalore, of all places. And just when Maul thinks he's about ready to put on the big boy pants, Sidious senses a disturbance in the Force. And he gets in his shuttle, and he flies out there all by himself, kills a whole bunch of people, and then knocks on Maul's door. And the first thing that happens is Maul shits his pants. He falls to his knees and he's like, "Oh, I've done all this for your glory, my lord." But Sidious can sense that he is being deceived, and he flat out says,
"You have become a rhino."
And he whips out 2 lightsabers. And both Savage and Maul have double-bladed lightsabers, but Sidious proves that he is indeed the Dark Lord of the Sith, and plays with them like a cat would play with a mouse. He outright kills Savage Opress and tortures Maul with Force lightning. And in the end, he says that he's going to leave Maul alive for some unforeseen purpose, and cackles as he continues to Force lightning the fuck out of that guy. Pretty savage. Coming in at number 4 is Vader at the end of Rogue One. Now, in comic books and in pulp, we have heard allusions that Vader is like a walking god when he fights, but we never really got to see it in the movie, because he's either fighting his son, who he doesn't really want to kill, or he's fighting an old man who's responsible for turning him into a quadriplegic burn victim. So of course he's going to hedge his bet. But here we get to see Vader doing Vader stuff the way we've always wanted to see him. He cuts a swath of blood through all those rebels, keeping his pace the whole time. He doesn't slow down. Now, why he didn't use the Force to yank that little data tape out of the guy's hand, I don't know. But that was pretty savage. Coming in at number 3 is Leia killing Jabba the Hutt. Now, Jabba, when he first sees Leia, he doesn't know that the bounty hunter was a woman. But as soon as he sees her, he licks his lips and parades her around in a bikini. And this is the thing that I always think about. Was Leia violated by Jabba? I would tend to think so. But even if he didn't physically molest her, he did embarrass her. He took a princess, royalty, a war hero, and made her wear a gold bikini for his amusement. And I don't think you get a sense for that in the movie as much, but if you read the novelization, Return of the Jedi by James Caan, we come upon this passage. It was during this directionless confusion that Leia acted. She jumped onto Jabba's throne, grabbed the chain which enslaved her, and wrapped it around his bulbous throat. Then she drove off the other side of the support, pulling the chain violently in her grasp. The small metal rings buried themselves into the loose folds of the Hutt's neck like a garrote. With the strength beyond her own strength, she pulled. He bucked with his huge torso, nearly breaking her fingers, nearly yanking her arms from their sockets. He could get no leverage. His bulk was too unwieldy. But just his sheer mass was almost enough to break any mere physical restraint. Yet Leia's hold was not merely physical. She closed her eyes, closed out the pain in her hands, focused all of her life force, and it was all able to channel into squeezing the breath from the horrid creature. So we see from the novelization that Leia Poppins wasn't the only time that she tapped Force ability. They're insinuating that she used the Force to kill Jabba the Hutt. And that is pretty savage. Now, coming in at number 2 is from the original Star Wars, before it was called New Hope, before it was a special edition. The first time we meet Han Solo, what happens? Some weirdo at a bar comes up to him and threatens his life, so what does the man do? He pulls out a blaster and blows a big hole in the guy. Now this is telling because before we got the huge backstory, Han Solo comes off kind of like a space pirate or a space cowboy. And the whole cantina bar had a Western feel about it. So of course there's going to be a gunfight. But think about it. You're a scoundrel. You live and die by the amount of money in your pocket, and some guy popping his mouth off at you is going to write a check his ass can't cash. And Han Solo was there to ensure that. And that, my friends, is pretty savage. Coming in at number 1 on my list for the most savage moment in Star Wars is Vader melting on the volcano. Now this is something I read about for years, and I had a certain image of it in my head, but I have to tell you that I was unprepared to see that in the theater, and it was truly horrifying the first time I saw it. There's still a part of me that's uncomfortable with it, but by now I'm so hyper familiar with the scene that its initial impact hasn't really dissipated from my awareness. And when I connect with that part of me that saw it for the first time, I was horrified. And there's honestly a part of me that thought it was pretty hardcore, considering that this is supposed to be a children's story. But I do believe that you have to see Vader's physical transformation and the pain and the suffering he endured to justify the sort of psyche he adopted once the suit became his, well, prison, really. Now, so again, from the Return of the Jedi novelization, we actually get a telling of the Mustafar scene from Force Ghost Obi-Wan Kenobi to Luke Skywalker. Your father, Anakin, was seduced by the dark side of the Force. He ceased to be Anakin Skywalker and became Darth Vader. When that happened, he betrayed everything that Anakin Skywalker believed in. The good man who was your father was destroyed. So what I told you was true, from a certain point of view. When I first encountered your father, Ben continued, he was already a great pilot, but what amazed me was how strongly the Force was with him. I took it upon myself to train Anakin in the ways of the Jedi. My mistake was thinking I could be as good a teacher as Yoda. I was not. Such was my foolish pride. The Emperor sensed Anakin's power, and he lured him to the dark side. He paused sadly and looked directly into Luke's eyes, as if he were asking for the boy's forgiveness. My pride had terrible consequences for the galaxy. You should not think of that machine as your father. When I saw what had become of him, I tried to dissuade him, to draw him back from the dark side. We fought. Your father fell into a molten pit. When your father clawed his way out of that fiery pool, the change had been burned into him forever. He was Darth Vader, without a trace of Anakin Skywalker. Irredeemably dark. Scarred. Kept alive only by machinery and his own black will. Savage. Now real quick, I wanted to do an honorable mention, and this is Luke tapping into the dark side, even if just for an instant, while he was fighting his father aboard the Death Star 2. And I know Disney has gone and tried to retcon this and say, no, he never touched the dark side. You can see it. And he did it just long enough to realize how much like his father he was becoming. And he looked at his hand, and he looked at the hand that he just cut off his father, and he made his decision. And in that moment, Luke was a Jedi. but before that, it was savage. Okay, now we're going to move on to the spiritual moments in Star Wars. And here's what's funny. It's easy to watch Star Wars on its own surface level and enjoy it for what it is. You know, you got guys fighting, you get love, you get redemption, all that kind of stuff. But the older that I got, and the more I got into spirituality and metaphysics, the more that aspect of Star Wars started to show to me. And I really can appreciate it on a very super deep level, and in ways that I can't talk to 90% of people about, because our heads are in the different places. And most people are entrapped by the dogma of their religion. But I am spiritual and not religious. I can take wisdom from every culture and roll it into my own understanding of all that is. And yes, I do believe in a unifying prime consciousness, but I don't think it's a old man sitting on a cloud watching you masturbate and then judging you for it. So coming in at number 5 for the most spiritual moments in Star Wars is that old phrase, luminous beings are we, not this crude matter. And we're most familiar with Yoda uttering those words to Luke. What's interesting, again from the novelization of Return of the Jedi, just before Vader dies, he says the same thing to Luke. And actually, it's unfair to call him Vader at this point. As soon as he picked up the Emperor, or just moments before, that's when Anakin came back. So, here we take from the novelization. Luke, help me take this mask off. Luke shook his head. You'll die. The Dark Lord's voice was weary. Nothing can stop that now. Just once, let me face you without it. Let me look on you with my own eyes. Luke was afraid to see his father as he really was, afraid to see what person could have become so dark, the same person who'd fathered Luke and Leia, afraid to know the Anakin Skywalker who lived inside Darth Vader. Vader too was afraid to let his son see him, to remove this armored mask that had been between them so long. The black armored mask that had been his only means of existing for over 20 years. It had been his voice, and his breath, and his invisibility, his shield against all human contact. But now he would remove it, and he would see his son before he died. Together, they lifted the heavy helmet from Vader's head. Inside the mask portion, a complicated breathing apparatus had to be disentangled, a speaking modulator and view screen detached from the power unit in his back. But when the mask was finally lifted off and set aside, Luke gazed at his father's face. It was the sad, benign face of an old man. Bald, beardless, with a mighty scar running from the top of his head to the back of the scalp. He had unfocused, deep-set dark eyes, and his skin was a pasty white, for it had not seen the sun in 2 decades. The old man smiled weakly. Tears glazed in his eyes now. For a moment, he looked not too unlike Ben. It was a face full of meanings that Luke would forever recall. Regret, he saw most plainly, and shame. Memories could be seen flashing across it. Memories of rich times, and horrors, and love too. It was a face that hadn't touched the world in a lifetime. In Luke's lifetime. He saw the wizened nostrils twitched as they tested a first tentative smell. He saw the head tilt imperceptibly to listen, for the first time without electronic auditory amplification. Luke felt a pang of remorse that the only sounds now to be heard were those of explosions, the only smells the pungent sting of electrical fires. Still, it was a touch, palpable, unfiltered. He saw the old eyes focus on him. Tears burned Luke's cheeks, fell on his father's lips. His father smiled at the taste. It was a face that had not seen itself in 20 years. Vader saw his son crying, and he knew it must have been at the horror of the face the boy beheld. It intensified momentarily. Vader's own sense of anguish to his crimes. Now he added guilt at the imagined repugnance of his appearance. But then, this brought him to mind of the way he used to look. Striking, grand, with a wry tilt to his brow that hinted of invincibility, and took in all of life with a wink. Yes, that was how he had looked once. And this memory brought a wave of other memories with it. Memories of brotherhood and home, his dear wife, the freedom of deep space, Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan, his friend, and how that friendship had turned. Turned he knew not how, but got injected nonetheless, with some uncaring virulence that festered until... Hold. These were memories he wanted none of, not now. Memories of molten lava crawling up his back. No. This boy had pulled him from that pit, here, now, with this act. This boy was good. The boy was good, and the boy had come from him, so there must have been good in him, too. He smiled again at his son for the first time. Loved him. And for the first time in many long years, loved himself again as well. Suddenly he smelled something, flared his nostrils, sniffed once more. Wildflowers? That was what it was, just blooming. It must be spring. And there was thunder. He cocked his head, strained his ears. Yes, spring thunder for a spring rain, to make the flowers bloom. And there he felt a raindrop on his lips. He licked the delicate droplet, but wait, it wasn't sweet water. It was salty. It was a teardrop. He focused on Luke once again and saw his son was crying. Yes, that was it. He was tasting the boy's grief. Because he looked so horrible. Because he was so horrible. But he wanted to make it all right for Luke. He wanted Luke to know he really wasn't ugly like this. Not deep inside. Not altogether. With a little self-deprecatory smile, he shook his head at Luke, explaining away the unsightly beast his son saw. Luminous beings are we, Luke, not this crude matter. Now again, there's like a wealth of knowledge in the book. In the scene that we got in the movie, we were only given like less than a minute. But this look inside of Anakin's head after all that time, and then giving a piece of Jedi wisdom at the end of his life, is monumentously spiritual. Coming in at number 4 is a scene from Revenge of the Sith. Fearing the impending loss of his wife from a horrible dream, Anakin Skywalker seeks out Master Yoda. And what does Yoda say? Afraid to lose somebody. Somebody close to you, And Anakin, controlling his feelings, says someone. Now he's being mindful of his thoughts, but he's not correctly interpreting the Force vision he was given. And Yoda warns against sensing the future. And when Anakin finally asks, "What must I do, Master Yoda?" Master Yoda says, "Train yourself to let go of everything you fear to lose." Now that's an easy truism for a teacher to speak, but it's almost impractically hard to practice. Many religions teach detachment or a sort of asceticism. And indeed, many of our great spiritual teachers have lived completely simplified lives, for what you possess ends up owning you. Well, Anakin does not have the emotional capacity to give up Padme. And this is a continuation of his issues with his mother and his temptation by the dark side. In the end, by trying to force things into being, he loses everything. But while it is impractical, I do believe there is intense spiritual wisdom in the words uttered by Yoda. Coming in at number 3 from Star Wars Rebels. Now, I'm not the hugest fan of this show as far as art direction goes, but there are some of the peak moments of Star Wars thanks to David Filoni. being George Lucas's Padawan, of course. And one of those interesting elements was the inclusion of a Force-sensitive entity called the Bendu, who was voiced by Tom Baker of Doctor Who fame. Now, it's interesting to note that George Lucas actually called the Jedi Bendu before it got shortened into Jedi. But what the Bendu does is he lives in the gray area between the light side and the dark side. He's able to draw on both without becoming corrupted by either. Which is interesting because this seems to be the sort of truth that Luke Skywalker came to prior to the events of the sequel trilogy, and indeed was seeking to instruct his new generation of Jedi with. Which is why I don't think he would have necessarily feared the darkness in Kylo Ren as we saw portrayed in the bastard fucking movie. But in the Bendu, embracing both the light side and the dark side, we see something of Taoism. And this is also coming from my martial arts instruction as well. But if you take the figure of the Taijitu, which most people call the yin-yang sign, you see that each element has an element of its opposite inside itself. And indeed, the extreme of one is the beginning of the expression of the other. So extreme yin is the same as minimum yang, and vice versa. Now indeed we see this. The Bendu actually pulls on the dark side to send bolts of lightning at his enemies. But neither does he claim allegiance to the Jedi or the Sith. He thinks that they're both flawed. And what we know from legends as the Ashla and the Bogan, as he calls it, the light side and the dark side, he thinks that they're all aspects of the same force. And why just emphasize one? So the Sith let themselves become consumed by the dark side because they believe in the power, and they don't believe that weak beings have any place in the Force. But that ends up being their undoing. And then the Jedi, of course, were too passive, which led to the manipulation and fall of their order. So it is an interesting line that the Bendu walks, and it is spiritual. Okay, coming in at number 2, we're going to pick on C-3PO just a little bit. Now, aboard the Tantive 4, he said, "Don't call..."
Don't you call me a mindless philosopher, you overweight glob of grease.
There is a novel concept there that I do want to touch on. We see at the end of Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith, that once C-3PO and R2-D2 were transferred into the custody of Captain Antilles, the last order that Bail Organa gives is have the protocol droids mind wiped. And R2's all shits and giggles about it. But most philosophers and martial artists, and indeed Master Yoda himself, said you must unlearn what you have learned. In my martial arts style, your body ideal state will be as pliable as an infant's. Stiff force is dead force and can be used against you. That's what I was taught. Now, the act of having 3PO's mind wiped, I think, was just a security precaution because he doesn't know how to keep his mouth shut, and he would have been like, oh yeah, I knew Darth Vader. Oh yeah, he had 2 kids. Can't do that in the New Empire. So they erased his memory, which explains why he was so aloof in A New Hope. And when we first saw The New Hope, we didn't know what the fuck was going on. We were just like thrown in the middle of a space battle, and suddenly we had to hang out with these 2 droids for most of the first act. And we knew that R2 knew what he had to do, but we didn't realize that R2 lived through all of that. And even in George Lucas's first treatment, R2 was the receptacle of all the knowledge of the Star Wars saga and the Skywalker history. But artificially, 3PO attained the state of no mind, which is something that old wise men have been trying to do their entire lives and sometimes never achieve. Artificially spiritual. And coming in at number 1, that is why you fail. Now, in The Empire Strikes Back, Luke Skywalker travels to the Dagobah system to meet Yoda, and Yoda is trying to teach him about the power of belief. Luke Skywalker is sitting there playing around with rocks and floating stuff, and then his X-Wing starts to sink, and he loses concentration and breaks his connection with the Force. And Yoda just kind of points at his X-Wing and he goes, yeah, lift it. And Luke is saying, that's impossible. Rocks is one thing, that's huge, I can't do it. Now Luke reaches out and he tries for a second, and just when Yoda was about to be impressed, Luke drops it. And he's panting and he's like, I can't do it, it's too big. Now Yoda gets stubborn and he's like, no, it's no different, it's only different in your mind. And Luke says, you want the impossible. And he goes and he sits down and acts like a 5-year-old spoiled bitch. So what does Yoda do? He exhales, he rolls his eyes, he calms his mind, he closes his eyes, and he raises a fucking X-Wing out of the swamp. And that, I believe, was a missed opportunity that we could have gotten The Last Jedi had Rian Johnson known what the fuck he was doing. But what this teaches us is the power of intent. What you focus on most fervently will become your reality, one way or another. If you think that you can't do anything, then you'll attract people and situations where you can't do anything. But if you believe that you can start a fucking YouTube channel and take over the world, guess what? You will do it. So as soon as Luke sees this X-Wing come out of the swamp, he runs over and he goes, I don't believe it. And Yoda goes, that is why you fail. Intensely spiritual advice there. Most of the spiritual advice you need, you can learn from Yoda. Just as I did an honorable mention for the savage stuff, I do want to do an honorable mention for the spiritual stuff. And that honorable mention is the overall concept of the Force. Now, the Force is something very special and unique in cinema. George Lucas was a passionate studier of world religion and philosophy in general, incorporating many Asian beliefs into Western culture, almost kind of like sneaking it in the back door. Now, ostensibly, the concept of the Force was needed to allude to a religion without necessarily having to explain it all and set up a god figure and all that kind of stuff. It's just like, no, there's a force connecting all living things. If you train hard enough in the psychic and martial arts skills, then you can tap into that force and use it. And then initially, before we had Sith and all that kind of stuff, it's like, how strong is your will? Will you use that force to dominate others, or will you use it to free others from oppression? And I think that's very close to how things actually are. And it's always going to be impossible to explain all this stuff from a human perspective using English words. But the best way I know how to explain it is the Force, or the prime creator, or the unifying consciousness of everything is like an ocean. And then we are like droplets of water that can emerge from it and then go back and rejoin it at some point. Now, I have had experiences where I've done like psychic and astral projection and, you know, a tiny bit of telekinesis, but nothing like on the order of the Jedi. And I've come to believe that those skills are like muscles that you have to work out in order to fully master. And then even with the idea of a long time ago in a galaxy far away, I think most humans understand that there was some sort of lost golden age where we were something more than we are now, and that we had lost something. And perhaps it's something that we yearn for. But if you believe in the cyclical nature of time, then we will move forward to a new golden age, but it's something that we have to forge for ourselves, which is why being creative and being imaginative is so very important and vital. And together with the concept of the Force, and with movies like Star Wars reminding us of what's true in life, it is indeed intensely spiritual. So, there we have it. The most savage, the most spiritual moments in Star Wars. My name is Immortal Coil. If you enjoyed this content, like, share, subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, and drop me a comment. Let me know what you want to see covered on future editions of Savage Spirituality. Check out my buddies, my brothers and sisters in the Fandom Collective. We are a group of channels dedicated to helping you get your voice heard, get your content out there, get you likes, get you subs. And remember, the Force will be with you, always.